I was in university, I lived in this old, slightly run-down house next to a church. It was one of those places that you move into because you're broke, and the rent is cheap enough to make you ignore the peeling paint and the creaky floors. The house was ancient, over 100 years old, but no one really knew its exact age. It had that distinct too many stories, too much history kind of vibe. I lived in the basement, while my housemate stayed upstairs. It wasn't until much later, after I'd moved out, that I found out the house was built on top of an old cemetery. Yeah, let that sink in. The land it stood on had once been a graveyard. And not just a few graves. At least 30 bodies were still buried there, forgotten under layers of time and concrete. No one knew why they hadn't been relocated before the house was built, but it explained so much about the bizarre things that happened while I was living there. From the moment I moved in, the house felt heavy. It's hard to describe, but it was like the air was thicker, especially in the basement. My room was small and dimly lit, with just a tiny window that barely let in any sunlight. Even during the day, shadows seemed to linger in the corners. At night, the house came alive with noises, footsteps creaking across the floorboards above me, faint thuds from the walls, and the occasional bang that made my heart race. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, right? Wood expands, pipes rattle, maybe even mice in the walls. But the footsteps were the hardest to ignore. They'd happen at odd hours, 2, 3 in the morning, when no one was supposed to be awake. I'd ask my housemates the next day who had been walking around, and they'd always shrug it off. I was asleep all night, they'd say. It didn't make sense, but I tried not to overthink it. Then there was my housemate's cat. You'd think having a pet around would make things less creepy, but not this one. The cat seemed off, like it could see things we couldn't. It would often sit in the middle of the room, staring intently at the wall or the empty doorway, its tail flicking like it was watching something move. One time I was in the kitchen late at night, and the back door creaked open on its own. I froze, staring at the door, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, even though it wasn't windy. Then, out of nowhere, the cat casually strolled in, like it had been waiting for the door to open. The scariest night for me, though, was the one with the shadow figure. I had this bookshelf right beside my bed, where I kept random stuff, books, candles, and this little Buddha statue I liked. It was nothing fancy, just something I'd picked up at a flea market. One night, I woke up to a loud crash. My heart was pounding, and when I opened my eyes, I saw this dark shape, solid but shadowy, leap off the bookshelf. It landed on the floor and darted out of the room faster than I could process. I was frozen, staring at the empty doorway, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. When I finally turned on the light, the bookshelf was tipped over. The Buddha statue was shattered on the floor. My first thought was that it had to be the cat, but the next morning, my housemate swore the cat had been locked in their room all night. That was the breaking point for me. Whatever was in that house didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. But the weirdness didn't stop with just footsteps and shadow figures. One night, after I'd already decided to move out, something even stranger happened. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I noticed this faint tapping sound. It was soft, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the small window in my room. At first, I thought it was just tree branches or something, but when I glanced over, there were no trees near the window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like whatever it was wanted me to look. I hesitated, every instinct in my body telling me not to move. But curiosity got the better of me. I turned my head slowly toward the window, and for a split second, I saw something. Just the faint outline of a face, pressed against the glass, staring in. Its features were blurry, almost smudged, like it wasn't fully there. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. Another time, one of my housemates told me they'd woken up in the middle of the night to find their door wide open. They were sure they'd closed and locked it before going to bed. When they got up to shut it, they felt this sudden rush of cold air, even though all the windows in the house were closed. They told me later that they'd felt like someone was standing just outside the door, watching them. After I moved out, the church started construction on the parking lot behind the house. That's when they found the human remains. It made headlines for a while. 30 skeletons, buried right under the asphalt. No one could explain why the graves had been left there, or why the house had been built on top of them. It was like the cemetery had been erased from history, forgotten by everyone except the ones buried there. Even now, I can't help but wonder if those restless spirits were trying to make themselves known. Maybe the house was haunted, or maybe it was just the energy of the land itself. Whatever it was, I'm glad I got out when I did. Sometimes history doesn't stay buried, and sometimes the past has a way of creeping into the present. I don't know what happened to the house after that. Maybe they tore it down, or maybe someone else moved in, completely unaware of what lies beneath. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that house, or the way it felt like it was alive, watching, waiting, holding on to secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. Alright, this whole thing went down about an hour ago, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. My buddy called me out of the blue, asking if I could help him out because his work car wouldn't start. He works as a security guard, checking out properties where there have been issues with vandalism or trespassing, so it's not unusual for him to end up in weird places late at night. He said the guy who could help him was at least 2 hours away, so I agreed to swing by. He sent me his location, and I didn't really think much of it until I got close. That's when I realized where he was, smack in the middle of a cemetery. Not just any cemetery either. This was one of those massive, old ones with towering gravestones, statues that look like they belonged in a horror movie, and those ancient trees with branches that seemed to claw at the sky. And of course, my friend was parked all the way on the far side of the property. Perfect. I drove in and immediately I felt uneasy. The road was gravel, winding through rows of gravestones, most of them faded and cracked with age. My headlights lit up just enough to make the shadows dance in weird ways. The further I went, the darker and quieter it got. It wasn't just silence, it was that kind of oppressive quiet where you start hearing your own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I just kept my eyes on the road. Eventually, I saw him waving his flashlight, standing next to his car in this small gravel lot surrounded by even more gravestones. His car was just sitting there, lifeless, under a patch of trees that blocked out what little moonlight there was. I pulled up next to him and asked, "What happened?" He told me his car just stopped. No warning, no sputtering, just dead. I grabbed my jumper cables and a pair of pliers from my trunk and had him pop the hood. Right away, I noticed one of his battery cables had come loose. Easy enough to fix. I tightened it as best as I could with the pliers, and as soon as the connection was secure, his car lights flickered back on. That's when we noticed we weren't alone. Just a few feet away, standing perfectly still, was a little kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, wearing what looked like dirty, outdated clothes. It was like they'd just appeared out of nowhere. My buddy, trying to stay calm, said hi and asked if they needed help. The kid didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us with this blank expression that sent chills down my spine. My friend and I exchanged a quick, nervous glance, and when we looked back, the kid was gone. Just like that. No sound, no movement, nothing. There was no way they could have run off without us hearing something. My friend started shining his flashlight around, checking between the gravestones and trees, but there was no sign of the kid. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. At this point, I was ready to get out of there, but my friend seemed frozen in place, his flashlight beam shaking just slightly. He mumbled something about how he'd seen shadows before, figures peeking out from behind trees or gravestones, but this was different. This wasn't a shadow, this was solid, real, or at least it seemed that way. As we were packing up to leave, I noticed something weird. The gravel near where the kid had been standing was disturbed, like someone or something had been pacing back and forth. But the pattern didn't make sense. It wasn't normal footprints. It was more like small, circular impressions, as if something had been spinning in place. I didn't point it out to my friend. I didn't want to freak him out even more, but it definitely didn't help my nerves. We got in our cars and started heading out of the cemetery. I let him go first, following close behind because, let's be honest, I wasn't about to drive through that place alone. As we made our way down the winding road, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just the shadows from the trees, but then I realized it was moving, following us. A dark shape, low to the ground, darting between the gravestones, keeping pace with my car. My stomach dropped. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I glanced back, it was still there, getting closer. By the time we reached the cemetery gates, it was gone. Or at least, I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't say anything to my friend when we pulled onto the main road, but I could tell he was just as rattled as I was. When we got back to my place, I tightened his battery cables properly, trying to keep the conversation light, like nothing weird had just happened. But then he told me something that made my blood run cold. After I'd left him to fix the cables, he'd heard faint laughter, like a child's, coming from the trees behind him. He didn't stick around to figure out where it was coming from. He got in his car and left as fast as he could. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The kid, the laughter, the shape I'd seen in my rearview mirror, it all felt connected somehow. I started Googling the cemetery, hoping to find some kind of explanation. Turns out, it's got a bit of a reputation. People have reported seeing a little boy wandering the grounds for years, always in the same old-fashioned clothes, always near the same part of the property. Some say he's harmless, just curious, but others believe he's something else entirely, something that shouldn't be there. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never setting foot in that cemetery again. There's something wrong with that place, something that doesn't want to stay hidden. And whatever it is, it's still out there, watching. Alright, so this happened a while ago, and honestly, I still don't know how I got roped into it. It's one of those why did I say yes moments that still makes me shake my head. Anyway, here we go. So I have these friends who are all about exploring creepy places. Like, they're the ones who think a haunted house sounds like a fun weekend plan. Me? Not so much. I enjoy not being terrified. One night, they start going on about this place called Stull Cemetery in Kansas. Apparently, it's legendary for being one of the gates of hell. Yeah, no thanks. I told them straight up I wasn't interested. Hard pass. But of course, curiosity got the better of me later, so I decided to Google it. Turns out, the legend is wild. Supposedly, way back in the day, a witch and the devil used to meet at this cemetery under this huge old tree. They say they even had a kid together, a deformed baby that didn't survive and was buried right there. Creepy enough, right? Well, there used to be a church on the grounds too, but it's mostly gone now. The rumors about the church are even crazier. People say it had a staircase that led straight to hell, and if you went down, what felt like 5 minutes would actually be 5 days. Oh, and it doesn't even have a roof anymore, but when it rains, the water somehow doesn't come inside. Totally normal, right? So I filed all this under nope, but fast forward to a Friday night. I'm the designated driver, dropping some friends off after the bar. Completely sober, just minding my own business. And who do I see in my driveway when I get back? My 3 genius friends, drunk and grinning, asking me to take them to, yep, you guessed it, Stull Cemetery. I tried to get out of it. I told them I was tired, told them they should just go to bed, but no. They hit me with the "we'll drive ourselves" card. Ugh, I couldn't let that happen. If something went wrong, I'd never forgive myself. So I sighed, grabbed some sage and holy water from my room, because why not, and said fine, but I wasn't getting out of the car. It was around 2:30 a.m. when we finally set off. The drive was quiet, the roads empty. As we got closer to Stull, the town got eerily still, like it was holding its breath. We passed a couple of houses with their lights off, a small trailer, and eventually a newer-looking church. Finally, we reached the hill leading down to the cemetery. On the left, there was a tree line and an old, overgrown driveway. On the right, there was the cemetery, dark and sprawling, with the ruins of the old church up on a hill in the distance. The closer we got, the creepier it felt. It wasn't just the look of the place, it was the atmosphere. It was like the air got heavier, thicker, the kind that presses down on you and makes your chest tighten. My friends were already getting jittery, whispering about how creepy it looked. But I was like, nope, you dragged me here, someone's getting out. We found the overgrown driveway and backed into it, hidden by the trees. My friends got out and disappeared around the corner of the cemetery fence. I stayed in the car, smoking a cigarette and trying to ignore the growing unease that was creeping up my spine. It was so quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. That's when I felt it. It started as a prickling at the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind the car watching me. My stomach dropped, and every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't want to look, but the feeling was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on me. I flipped up the rearview mirror to avoid seeing anything I didn't want to see, lit my sage, and grabbed the holy water. That's when the car shook. 3 hard, deliberate hits from the back. My heart was pounding as I squeezed my eyes shut, praying under my breath. Before I could even process what was happening, my friends came sprinting back to the car, yelling at me to drive. They piled in, breathless, and I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas, kicking up dirt and gravel as we sped out of there. Once we were back on the main road, I finally asked them what happened. They said that while they were near the tree line, they heard heavy footsteps in the woods. Branches snapping, something big moving closer. Then they heard whispers, low, guttural voices that didn't sound human, and finally, a scream. Not just any scream, but this blood-curdling, inhuman sound that froze them in their tracks. That's when they bolted. As if that wasn't bad enough, one of them suggested we go back because they didn't get a good enough look at the cemetery. Against my better judgment, I agreed. This time, I parked near the newer church across the street. I figured I'd be safer there, able to see everything. They grabbed a flashlight and promised to signal me 3 times if they needed anything. I watched as they disappeared into the cemetery through a hole in the fence. I kept an eye on the old church, its dark silhouette looming on the hill. That's when I saw movement, someone climbing up the hill and disappearing behind the church. I assumed it was one of my friends, but when I saw 3 flashes of light through the church windows, I flashed my headlights back to signal them. A few minutes later, my friends came sprinting back again, looking pale and shaken. They jumped in the car and told me to leave. I started driving, but the tension in the car was unbearable. Finally, I asked what happened. They said they'd heard footsteps and voices again, but this time they saw a tall, shadowy figure standing near the church. They thought it was me flashing the lights, but when they got closer, the figure let out another unearthly scream, and they ran. Here's the kicker. When I told them about the person I saw climbing the hill and the flashes from the church, they went silent. None of them had gone near the church or flashed their light. We didn't say much after that. We got back to campus around 5 a.m. and went our separate ways. None of us have brought it up since. All I know is I'm never going near Stoll Cemetery again. Whatever's out there, it's not something I want to mess with.